Alright, welcome to a video on NextAuth. If you haven't already gone through the last video on authentication, might be a good idea. This introduces cookies. This one will introduce how can you use cookies for authentication but delegate a lot of things to this library called NextAuth. Harkirat, can I do things without NextAuth? Yes, NextAuth is just one library that lets you do authentication. It's very popular, it's very modular. It lets you connect to various data sources. By data sources, I mean, log in with Google, log in with Facebook, and a bunch of other providers. So it's pretty extensible. It's good enough, is mostly used everywhere. No one rolls their own authentication in Next.js. Maybe people do, I don't know. But generally, this is good enough, a great abstracted library that takes away a lot of pain for authentication in Next.js. What is NextAuth? NextAuth is a library that lets you do authentication in Next.js. Can you do it without NextAuth? Yes. Should you? Probably not. At least in a Next.js project. Does it work outside a Next.js? The name itself has NextAuth? Probably does not. Popular choices to do auth include external providers. These are websites you might have heard of, auth0.com and clerk.com. This one's become very famous initially, suddenly. These websites let you do authentication fairly easily, like one-click authentication, even if you don't know cookies, even if you don't know, a library like NextAuth. If you want to really get off the ground very quickly, you can use an external provider. What is the downside? They're very, 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 very expensive. So keep that in mind. Firebase Auth isn't expensive, but Clerk and Auth are on another level. And the problem with Firebase Auth is it's very hard to move out of Firebase if you're using Firebase Auth. So that's the reason I wouldn't use these. It's very hard to move out of them, and since they get expensive over time, they've of course made it in a way it's very hard to move out. But it's a good idea to just keep things in-house, but at the same time use a library that abstracts a lot of things, so you don't have to write a lot of code. In-house using cookies, you can still do something very similar to what we did in the last class. What was the last class? This authentication class right here. You can do something similar in Next.js API servers as well, like the API routes as well. But again, probably shouldn't do it. Just use NextAuth. Amazing library, abstracts away a lot of things for you. Before that, why not use JWT plus local storage, Harkirat? Why do you even need cookies? Why does NextAuth rely on cookies compared to local storage? And we already answered this in this authentication video, but let me again take you through a brief of it. The problem is, if you have a React application, then the first request that goes out to, let's say, facebook.com, the response that you get back has the index.html, index.js. This response does not have any user-specific things. This is the reason you can distribute this via a CDN, a content delivery network. This is the reason these can be cached. But when the second request goes out, when you get back the HTML JavaScript here on the front end in the browser, then whatever request you send out, you can use the local storage token and send it along with it. That's how React works. You cannot do the same thing in Next.js. The first request that goes out in Next.js goes out to your Next server, and this one needs to have some authentication information. If you are storing everything in local storage, you cannot send that over in the very first request. If you remember from the last video, the example that I showed you was, if you go to app.100xdevs.com, the very first request, if I refresh this again, sends this cookie over here, but it does not send an authorization header. I cannot do, please go here and set authorization header as local storage dot get item token. You cannot do that. Whenever you go to a website, either the browser is by default sending a header, which cookie is the best example for. Cookies are sent by default, or you have to go down the React route and do client-side rendering. You have to do something like this. Okay, by the first request will have no authentication information. So first just give me the JavaScript bundle, and eventually in the follow-up requests, I will send over the token. Why is this bad? Because this has client-side rendering. And Next.js isn't a client-side rendered framework. If people come to this website, I want them to see this immediately pre-rendered from the server, which means they need to send me authentication information in the first request itself. This is why you need to use cookies. In Nextauth, you cannot use local storage unless you're doing client-side rendering in Nextauth, which you shouldn't, which means, you're doing all of this inside a use effect on the client, which takes away the benefit of using Next.js, right? Next.js gives you the benefit of SEO optimization. It gives you the benefit of, okay, bhai, whenever the first request goes out, the response that you get back will have all of these courses rendered so that, when Google comes to this page, it can see all of these courses and SEO optimize your page. It understands that these all courses are part of this specific Amber 100x devs cohort. If I refresh this again, the first request that goes out, if you look at the response, in all the HTML, there is, courses, all this information here, 0 to 100. You get the idea. It's right here in the HTML. There's an image tag and everything. So it's able to index it. Google is able to index it pretty well. For that, you need to make sure the first request is carrying some authentication information, which cookies let you do. Cookies by default will send whatever cookies were set in every request. That's why you cannot roll your own local storage authentication in Next.js. It will still work if you do client-side rendering, but then it takes away the benefits of using Next.js, which is server-side rendering. We discussed the same thing in a little more detail in the last video as well. Okay, Arghiyat, so Next.js is a framework. It uses cookies for authentication. Let's see how it works. Next.js, what is Nextauth? Nextauth, it should be Nextauth, lets you add authentication to your Next app. It supports the following providers. As I said, it lets you, do login with Google, login with GitHub, login with Facebook in very simple, one line of code. This is the default code that you see on their website. Don't worry about it if you don't understand it. But if you go to Nextauth and search for this, you'll see it gives you, a basic code of how this will work. We'll eventually write this slowly and try to understand this slightly better. If you look at the live demo, you'll see this is a random website, and if I click on sign in, it takes me to this page where I can sign in with GitHub. If I click on this, it'll take me to a authorization page. I can authorize Nextauth. It'll go back to the page and have me logged in. That's why you want to use Nextauth. And was there something else here? No, not really. Let's move on to the fourth slide. All right. Next up, let's understand catch-all routes. They'll probably call it dynamic routes as well. Basically, if you're building a Next.js application and you want to catch all the requests that are going out to, let's say, /API/auth/user, /API/auth/random, /API/auth/123, so on and so forth. Basically, any request that starts from /API/auth. How would you write this code? We discussed this a little bit during our Next.js class, but let me do a refresher / explain this one more time. Let's go step by step and try to create a simple Next.js application. npx create next @latest. This is the command that you run that lets you bootstrap a simple Next.js application. I hope it's right. I think create next is the right package. And after that happens, you just have to open it in Visual Studio Code. Let me do that. This might not be the wrong. Create next app. So npx create next app. I'm going to call it week 16.5, I guess. Yes. Basically keep pressing enter. And I'm going to open this folder in Visual Studio Code. Let me go back to the terminal and make sure everything is on the up and up. Seems like it's still installing. I'll wait. There you go, installation complete. Now I want to add a route that catches all requests on /API /auth /anything. Okay, bhai, A, B, C, D, E doesn't matter. Any request that's going on to /API /auth /whatever. It could literally be this as well. It could be /API /auth another route another route another route, so on and so forth. Doesn't necessarily mean you can only put a single thing. You can have like multiple, sub routes afterwards. I want to catch all of these requests. What does catch mean? It means I want to write a handler that will handle all of these requests irrespective of what the route is. How can I write that in Next.js, specifically Next 13? The answer is you can do something like this. Whenever you're adding the next folder, add it like this: square braces, dot, and then give this a name. The name here doesn't really matter. It will come later on, but it won't be a part of the route handler. I can name it auth routes. Yeah, sounds good. And then inside add route.ts. Now, any request that's coming to /API /auth /whatever, doesn't matter how many subroutes or subroutes you call, the request will be handled by this guy: export function get return next response dot JSON message. Let's see. This is what every GET request that's coming here will catch. This is a global catch, or more specifically, what was it called? What did I put in the slides? A catch all handler. Any request that's coming to /API /auth /whatever will reach here. Let's see if that's true. Let me run npm run dev, go back to the browser and open this and go to /API /API /auth /random, and I get back message ASD. I go to something else, still get back the same thing. Go to something else, doesn't matter how many I add, says message ASD. What if I remove, if I just go to API, it says page not found. But anything at API /auth /whatever will be caught by this specific endpoint. Harkirat, why did API /auth not get caught? The answer is the handler for that will be here, right? API /auth /route.ts. So if I add one here, API /auth /route.ts, then this one will handle /API /route. /API /auth. But if you want /API /auth /anything, then it will be this route handler. If I add a post here, then every post request to /API /auth /anything will be caught by this post handler, so on and so forth. Hopefully that's clear, not too difficult. The only question you might have is, Kirkiyat, how do I know the exact route where this request is coming from? How can I extract this domain over here somehow so that I know where this request is coming? Because in the end you'll have, when you're writing something like this, you probably need access to this dynamic parameter. A place where this is used in app.100xdev.com is when you go to a course. As you can see, it says /courses/3. If I go to a different course, it will say /courses/2. So this is also a global catch somewhere in this website that's handling all requests to /courses/ course ID /page.tsx. So yeah, you can basically do the same thing on the front end as well. If this is an API route, but I can also have a global catch or a global page that handles all the front ends at a specific endpoint, like /courses/1 /courses/2. If I add something like this over here, if I add courses, I guess we can try to build the same thing, /courses/anything, which means ... course ID. Saved the wrong thing. and then page.tsx, export default function, return div course page. What did I do? I created a front end page for that handles all requests on /courses/anything. So if I go to localhost :3000/courses/1, you will see it says course page. If I go to /courses/2, course page. Question is, how do I extract this to 1 over here, or how do I extract the same thing over here? Because if you look at the website, you can go deeper and deeper. /2/169/170. All of these are probably being handled by a global cache. How do I get all of these dynamic routes somewhere, let's say, here? How do I access these dynamic routes? And the answer is, if you remember, the first argument you got here was the request argument. Next, request, from which you can access the body, the cookies, things like these, or the headers. The second argument that you have has this thing called params. I'm not sure if it's inside or outside, but let's see. Let's make this any, and let's try to log these params. Okay, what exactly is this second argument over here? We refresh the page. Let me go to this endpoint. And what do you see? You see the params that got logged. That makes sense. It's supposed to be like this. Has a key called params, which has auth routes, which is the same thing I had here. And it has the current page I am on, /asd/ads/asd, so on and so forth. So if I log, firstly, if I make sure I destructure params from the second argument, then the type of params would be something like this: auth routes string array. Now this might feel very complicated to you if you've not done TypeScript specifically. So you can totally do this also. Arg, any arg means argument. And the thing that you need access to is basically console.log arg.params.authroutes. Is that it? That's it. Now if I go back to this page, let's see. It renders ASD, ADS, ASD, DAS, which is exactly the 4 routes after /API/auth. ASD, ADS, ASD, ADS, ASD, DAS, ASD, DAS. So arg.params.authroutes, or if you want to get fancy, from this arg, you can destructure params over here. If you want to get really fancy, you can actually also destructure auth routes over here. This is some fancy maths, not maths, like you get the idea. A fancy way to extract keys from an object. You don't have to. You can always totally do this, or you can get a little fancy like this. If I'm doing this right, let's see. There you go. If you look at the log, if I refresh this page, it gives me the same thing. If I want to give, generally a good idea to not use any and give it a type. But again, if you don't understand this part, it's mostly fine, but you should brush up your TypeScript skills a bit. I don't want to confuse you with TypeScript in a Next.js class. But if I had to write the right types for it, it'll look something like this. All right. Spend some time here. If this seems very complicated, and if it takes you more than 20 minutes to figure it out, then just use arg and do a arg dot params dot auth routes. It's the same thing, and feel free to give it an any type for now. The good thing is we don't have to do any of this. This is just to understand these catch-all routes or dynamic routes. As to what this syntax even does. We don't have to write any code here. The library next auth that we're using will write most of the code. We just need to understand कि भाई if a request looks something like this, it means it's a catch-all handler, and any request that's coming out to /API/auth/ whatever can be handled by this guy, and this guy can access what the current route is. What do I mean by the current route? I mean, in this case it is ASD ASDDS, but you get the idea. It could totally be, API/auth/user/1. Here you see user1. Oh, do you see it? You don't see it, right? I don't know how long I've been doing this, but yeah, let me move them to the other side. User and 1 get logged if you are at /user/1. If I go to /user/2/3, I see user 2, 3. That's the idea. That's how you get the set of routes. You don't need this for next auth. You'll eventually see how, we just add a bunch of next auth code over here and it just works. Let's get to that probably in the next slide. Let's see. Yeah, there you go. Let's get to that in the next slide.
All right, guys, my mic is back. My audio might be suddenly much better than yesterday. Now we're going to understand how you can actually integrate the next auth library. Why did I teach about these catch-all routes? Because they're needed when you use the next auth library. The next auth library says, okay, bhai, any request that starts from this, please let me handle it. In fact, if I go to app.100xdevs.com, click on login over here and put a random email and password. When I click on the login button, you will notice the request goes out where? To /API/auth/something. /API/auth/something. Even the third one starts with /API/auth/something. What does that tell you? Okay, all the requests that start with /API/auth, this library says, okay, bro, we will handle. So just give me a catch-all on this specific folder. So what's the first thing you have to do? I've cleaned up my project a little bit. Feel free to do that on your side as well. The first thing you have to do is add a catch-all on API auth next auth and then route.ts. And here export const get equal to some function. Export const post is also going to be some function. Question is, what exactly all the get requests that are coming to /API/auth/anything, and what exactly should all the post requests be handled by? Should it be a function you write yourself, or should it be something that comes from the next auth library? So the first thing you have to do is install next auth, npm install next-auth. And then generally you would look at the docs, right? So look at the next auth docs, or, I've summarized all the steps here. Okay, after you've done an npm install of next auth, you will add the handler. Thing to notice is it should be /API/auth, and this should also be small next small auth. Don't write a random name here, because whenever the request is being handled, the next auth library is accessing it in, params.next auth variable. So this next auth and this folder name should be right. Shouldn't be next auth, or this shouldn't be next capital AUTH. Given that, question is, what should this handler be? And the answer is, this handler is this function that comes from next auth. So const handler equal to next auth, call this. You have to pass in some arguments, which we haven't right now. We will very soon. But this is how the catch-all route at /API/auth/anything looks like. It says, bro, any request that's coming to get, any get or post request that starts with /API/auth/anything will be handled by this next auth library. Inside the next auth library, somewhere there is some code that is able to, do session management. That's how, that's why the first thing that you have to do is this, and that's how next auth handles authentication. Question is, what do you pass in here? How do you tell it, okay, you have to do a login with password, email, or you have to do a login with Google so on and so forth. And the answer is by adding something called providers. Next auth lets you add high level 3 types of providers. If I go to next auth, get started, you will see there's a section called providers here. A bunch of providers, auth.o, GitHub, email, Discord, so on and so forth. And if you look at configuration, it will tell you we have broadly 3 types of providers. OAuth providers, which means login with Google, login with Facebook, login with GitHub, Twitter. Email without a password, which means, password-less login. The user comes to your website and there is a single input box for them for their email. They put their email here, they press a button below it called submit, and an email goes out to them on whatever their email is, gmail.com. And then they click on a link here and that actually, verifies their identity and they log into this website. We won't be discussing this today, but passwordless email login is fairly common. At least if not passwordless email, you might have definitely seen passwordless OTP, like phone numbers. You might have gone to a mobile app, very common in mobile apps. Okay, they don't ask you for a password. They say, just give me your phone number. I'll send you an OTP to your phone number. Put that OTP here. So this is what the second type is. And the third type is credentials. This basically says, do whatever you want. Here you have to, it's opinionated. Login with Google, login with Facebook, opinionated. Login with email, passwordless. Here it is like, build it however you want. The credentials provider allows you to handle signing in with arbitrary credentials, such as username, password, or two-factor authentication, or hardware devices, or even if you want to do login with MetaMask, if you know MetaMask or Web3 a little bit, Web3 authentication, next auth. If you look at this link, this website, as soon as I opened it, it opened this wallet of mine. So even when you want to do this, you will use the credentials provider. So that's what this third type does. We are going to implement today login with email and password. So we'll use the credentials provider. We'll also understand OAuth and login with Google. Right. Let's understand how can we add our very first provider, the provider that uses email plus password. Let's see how you can create your own authentication strategy. As I said, this specific strategy, if you're using the credentials provider, you can use it for username password, but you can use it for phone number based password. You can use it for any specific strategy you might have. You might have a website where there is a single input box that says admin password, and whoever has the admin password and writes it over here and clicks on submit gets access to your website. So it purely depends on how you want to architect what the login input fields look like. But most commonly, what are the input fields? It's email and password, right? So that's what we'll try to implement in this section. Steps to follow. There are a few steps here. So, one by one, let's try to understand all of them. Step number 1 is, if you remember Visual Studio Code before this is what we did. We wrote a handler inside which we passed in a config. The question is, what should we pass in the config? How do you tell it you have to use login with email and password? And the answer is by giving it a providers array. Okay, bro, you are going to have these providers, Google, Facebook, and right now we are going to do credentials provider. And where does this come from? It comes from import from, let's see, I'll have to open them side by side here. Even I don't know where it comes from nextauth /providers/credentials. Okay, bhai, there are going to be multiple providers. Eventually we'll add login with Google and login with Facebook here. So, we'll have something like Google provider and Facebook provider, so on and so forth. But right now we have a single credentials provider. Okay, bhai, what does credentials mean? Okay, we decide what the credentials are going to look like. We decide what the input fields are going to look like. If you look here, it says username and password. So we'll see what that is very soon. Credential providers accepts an object as an argument where you give it a name. We'll see where this name comes in handy later on. Let me write email over here. We'll see what that means. Credentials. कि भाई what all input boxes do I have? Do I have a simple admin password? No, we have two input fields, a username field and a password field. So that is what we have to share over here. Okay, bhai, we will have two input fields. We expect the user to give us two things. And if you look at it, we don't simply say username string. It is an object where you have to specify कि भाई what is the label of this. We'll see what label means. What is the type of this? Is it of type text or password? We'll see where this comes in handy later on. And what is the placeholder of this? Let me change this to email and password as well. If I open these side by side again, the one thing that's left is this authorize function at the end. Let me add it, but I'll share later what this specific guy does. For now, I've just given it some basic arguments. Ki bhai, you will have a username field, you will have a password field, and your name is email. I still see a red squiggly over here. Cannot see credential provider because it's credentials provider, and this will be small c. This is all the code that I have to write to add login with email and password. I still need to fill in this third thing over here called authorize. We'll see what that is very soon. But even just writing this much code will give you something. Let's see what that something is. If I type npm run dev and go to localhost :3000 /API/auth/signin. Yeah. Can you see my website has a very nice HTML page where there is an email field? Oh, this looks similar to the label over here. If I change this to username, that is what I see here as well. So that is what this label means. Type text. If I'm typing inside, I see the text over here. And placeholder email. If I remove this, there's a placeholder here called email. Similarly, password, label is password. I see password here. Type is password, which means if I type something, I see stars over here, and placeholder is also password. If you have a fancy website, okay, bhai, user needs to have username also, password also, and let's say an OTP also. Then you can add a third argument here. And if I refresh, I see username, password, and OTP. Of course, if I replace these. So depends on how you want to roll your authentication. But most websites will do what? They'll just do email and password. So that's what we are going to stick with as well. This is good because it lets you be very flexible. And by flexible, I mean, you know, as you saw a while back, we saw a Web3 page like this. A Web3 authentication next auth. If I go here, this page is also a website. It's written in Next.js plus next auth. And as soon as you visit this page, your wallet opens up. And if you look at the code a little bit, they also have a credentials provider that they're using. And if you look at it, they have a single credential called address, which is your public key address. So this is very flexible. You only see a simple use case right now because your email password is the most simple use case, but you can extend this to 10 different things, which is why this credentials provider is super powerful. Given that, now the question is what happens when you give it an email and password and click on the sign in with email button. Maybe even before that, you might ask, Harkirat, where is signing up? I need a sign up page as well. Should I go to /auth/user/sign up? And the answer is no. Next auth is not a user management library. Next auth says, bro, you need a sign up page, create your own sign up page. I don't care. Go to create a sign up folder, create a page.tsx, export default function, return div, sign up page, have input fields here, whatever. Whenever you want to send the user to the sign up page, you send them to your own created sign up page. When they click on, if I add an input field here, text, button, submit. If I have like I can add placeholders here, but you get the idea. Let me quickly add them. So there's a username field, password field, and a submit button. You create this yourself. You write the logic to, put the user in your database. Next auth is a session management library. Next auth says, right, given you have a user in your database, whatever, I will create cookies for you. When the user comes to this page, after you've signed them up, send them to this page. I will create cookies for them. I will manage the session. I don't know how you store your users or where you store your users. That purely depends on you. That is why Nextauth will never give you a sign up page. That you have to build yourself and do user creation yourself. What this guy will let you do is do session management, which means it will let you create cookies, create JWTs and send them to the browser. That is where this third authorize function comes into the picture. Okay, bhai, whenever the user writes an email and password, control will reach here when they click on sign in with email. When they click on sign in with email, control will reach here. You, as in the developer, has to write the logic. Ki, acha, const username equal to credentials dot username, and then password equal to credentials dot password, and then I have to do a prisma dot user dot find one. You get the idea, where email is username, password is whatever the password is, and then if you find it, of course we don't have Prisma right now, which is why you see the red squiggly, but if you do find it, if you did have Prisma, then you can return the credentials of that user. By credentials I mean whatever you want is stored in the token, stored in the JWT. Okay, bhai, I want the ID stored, which will be user.id. I maybe want the email stored, which will be user.email, so on and so forth. And in case there is an error over here, this will throw an error. The error will show up on this website. So the way you do authorization, the way you do authentication, the way you make sure that bhai, when the user clicks here, some logic runs that tells the Nextauth library that bhai, this is the user if things are fine, and if things are not fine, if there is ever an error thrown here, or if user doesn't exist, if there is no user with this username and password, you can simply return null. Nextauth will understand that the credentials were incorrect and it will let the front end know. So if I do return null over here, let me remove everything else over here. Let me log username and password just to show you, or just credentials. Console.log credentials. If I log credentials and return null, then you will notice if I refresh and save, it says sign in failed. Check the details you have provided. But if I return a real user's ID and maybe their name, of course this will come from the database eventually, and their email. If I sign in with email, now it logged in. As you can see, I reached the front end page. We haven't written any logic that shows the user their name, their feed, their whatever, but at least the login succeeded. If I refresh this page one more time, and let me remove this error at the top, and put some random credentials and click on sign in with email, as you can see, username and password reached the authorize function. We didn't do any validation here, but eventually you should do validation. And then we returned, okay, bhai, this user ka detail ye raha. These are the details of this user. So that is how you add a credentials provider that lets you do login with email and password. What have we not written? We haven't written any database logic yet, which we can eventually write. I mean, whenever we're creating a full-fledged project. The other question you might have now is, where do I see the user's detail? You are telling me, Harkirat, that the user is logged in. Firstly, prove to me that the user is logged in. I will say sure. If you put some username and password, go to the network tab, click on sign in with email, you will see the response that you get back has a set cookie header, which tells you the server returned you a cookie that looks like this, next auth session token, and hence that the server has returned you some token. Now if I refresh any page including localhost colon 3000, you will see the same cookie going out in the request headers. If I go, there you go, next auth session token. So this is how you can prove why the cookie though has been set, and nowhere did I have to write res.cookie token something. Next auth library took care of it. All you had to do was tell the next auth library, Right, this is my validation logic. If the user has logged in, I will return you the user's details if the user is logged in or if the credentials are right. If not, I will return you null, and then you can tell the user that the credentials are incorrect. This is the starting point of creating sign in or a basic sign in page in Next.js using NextAuth. But there are a few more things to do, right? The first thing you might want to do is, as I said, maybe show a sign in button over here. Yeah, that's probably a good idea, right? When the user comes to your landing page, you want to show them a sign in button. When they click on the sign in button, they should be redirected to /API/auth/sign in, right? How do you do that? Harkirat, I can just write a button and add redirect to /API. You can do that. But why not do something like this? Let's go back to the top level page, app/page.tsx. And let me add a app bar here. What does an app bar mean? You go to any website, you'll see, a top bar over there, right? Facebook doesn't have it, but you get the idea. If you go to app.100xdevs.com, this thing is called the app bar. And this usually has the login button over here. So let's try to add a login button to our website. I've added an app bar. Let me go to components/appbar.tsx. Let me export an app bar over here. What do I need? I need a button called sign in. Where does this redirect? Where should this redirect? On click equal to, where should it go? Harkirat, it should go to route. If you remember, const use router from next/navigation. Import const router equal to use router. And then you can do a router.push /API/auth/sign-in. This totally works. If I go back to my website, you will see it says app bar is not defined because I need to go to page.tsx. It says use router is only allowed in client components. So if I go back here, I should probably make this a client component. And now if you look at it, I have a sign in button in the app bar. Of course, it's the ugliest app bar that you've seen, but you get the idea. If I click on it, it takes me to the login page. This is great, and this totally works. But one thing that NextAuth provides you is it provides you these functions out of the box called sign in and sign out. So you can actually do something like this. You can import sign in and sign out from next-auth/react. And you can call this here directly. You don't have to do any of the router logic. Just call sign in over here. It will automatically take you to the sign in page. And this also gives us the benefit of adding like a logout button, where all I have to do is call sign out from this library and it will sign the user out. Now, if I go here, I see two buttons, sign in and log out. If I click on sign in, it takes me to this page. If I click on logout, it will actually log me out. We'll see that eventually, like when we make the front end more prettier and, not prettier, but you'll see the user's details here. But as you can see, even these are things that, NextAuth provides you out of the box. You can just call these functions. You don't have to worry about writing your own navigation logic. Great. One more thing that you should do before you proceed is add these two secrets. Well, the first one isn't a secret, but the second one is a secret. Add both of these to your top level env. You might not have this top level env, so go to the root folder and create a .env file. And over there, paste the next auth URL, which means where are you doing authentication right now? We're doing it at http://localhost:3000. But when you deploy this to, wherever your website is, then you have to replace this with app.100xdevs, or, wherever your website is deployed. So, wherever I've deployed the code of app.100xdevs.com, I have replaced this next auth URL with app.100xdevs.com. If you deployed it to a different website of your own, mywebsite.com, make sure to replace this next auth URL. And this secret is the secret that's used to, encode your tokens whenever, whenever you're logging in, still JWT tokens are being created. This is the password for them. Very similar to how we've used passwords in the past for doing, if you remember, JWT.sign. Whenever we did a JWT.sign, the second argument was a password. This password we're storing over here in this top level.env file. This is something you should never share with anyone. This is it's an open thing. Doesn't have to be, the .env file isn't really a secret, but still, good place to show it. The next auth secret, as you can see, I'm already using in, the credentials provider, at least here. I did not add that logic here. So let me do that. If I go to, what's it called? Next auth route/yes. Here I can add a secret, which in my case is going to be process.env.next auth _secret. Okay, bhai, whenever you're encoding or decoding using a JWT, use this secret. Can I hard code it like this? Yes, you can. Should you? You shouldn't. You should pick it up from a .env file. All right. Next up, we need to wrap our application inside a session provider that comes from next auth/react. Very similar to how we have used recoil root in the past and wrapped our application inside a recoil root. But these sort of need to be in a client component. Basically, if you try to do this, if you, from first principles, understand that I need to wrap up my application. So let me go to layout.tsx and, import the session provider and wrap everything inside the session provider. If you try to do this and open localhost 20,000, it will say React context is not available in server components because the root layout is not a client component. What if I make it a client component? You shouldn't for 1,000 reasons, but even if you do, it will tell you, okay, you cannot export this metadata from a client component. You need it in a server component. So generally good practice is that whatever context providers that you need, be it recoil root or be it the session provider, you put them all in a separate file called, you can call it whatever you want, but I usually call it providers.tsx. And here, number one, you make this a client component. Number two, you export const providers, which, or export function providers, doesn't matter, which wraps everything inside a session provider. You can give it any type for now. If you want to get fancy, you can also give it children react.react node. Here I wrote a bunch of things. So let me explain what this providers.tsx does. It says that whoever wants to use me, please use me like this and pass me some children. Harkirat, how do I pass providers? If I import this correctly, how do I pass providers a prop called children? Should I do this, Harkirat? Children equal to something. No, if you remember from the past, anything that you pass inside a component automatically reaches this children prop over here. The question is, Harkirat, where does this root layout get children from? The answer remains the same. Even root layout is a component, and whoever calls this, passes it sub children, and those children get rendered at the very end inside HTML and body. That's what root layout does. And now, along with HTML and body, we wrap it inside all of our providers, which exist in a client component. Specifically, we only have session provider. But if you go to 100x devs code base, you'll see we have theme provider, session provider, recoil root in this top level providers.tsx. And we've wrapped everything inside these three providers. So whenever you have client side providers that you need, usually a good idea to put them in this top level providers.tsx and wrap everything, all the children in the layout, root level layout inside these providers. We'll see why we need this later on as well. Given that we have this provider and we've wrapped everything inside this providers, next step is, how can you now begin to see the user's details? How can I, Harkirat, render harkirat@gmail.com or whatever my email and password is, or whatever is present in the token? The answer is app.tsx. If I go to app bar, you can simply use a hook called use session that comes from next auth slash react, and you can render session over here. Harkirat, why did you have to JSON.stringify it? Because session is an object and you can't really put an object here. If you do, it says objects are not valid children, which is why you have to wrap it inside a JSON.stringify. If I refresh this, now you will see कि हाँ भाई, Harkirat name, email, status authenticated is coming from somewhere. Where is this coming from? It's coming from the next auth configuration, where currently I return this user for everyone. Doesn't matter who is logging in, doesn't matter what the credentials are. I completely ignore the credentials over here. I just log them and return a hard coded user. And you can get the details of that hard coded users here. Eventually, when you hit the database from here, you will get the real user information here. This use session hook is what you can use for client side components to get information about the user. The next question you might ask is, how do I do the same thing in a server side component, Harkirat? Let's say there is a page here called, user/page.tsx. Given that this is a server component, Harkirat, how can I see the user details here? Default function return div server or whatever user component. How do I see the user's details here? And you might think, I can do the same thing. Const session equal to use session and render it. But as you can see, it comes from next auth slash react. You can't really use this session on a server component. This is a server component. I haven't added use client at the top, which is why if I now go to the /user page, you will see an error. It says React context is unavailable in the server component. If you're using a server component, you have to use the get server session hook. Const session equal to, it's not even a hook, it's actually a function, I think. Async. You have to, number one, make the function async. Number two, await on get server session. And of course, stringify this. And now, as you can see, I see the user's name and email in a server component, in a component that's not rendered on the client. Where do we see the client component? In the app bar. If I render the app bar here, then you will see, I see the user's details here as well. In a client component, this has some extra information, status, authenticated. I see it on a server component as well. This is great. It's a great start. We see the user's details on a client. You see the user's details, on a client and on the server. One more question you might ask is, Harkirat, what if I create an API endpoint? API slash, user slash route.ts. Answer remains the same, right? Export function get. You can still use this get server session and get the user's details. Let's say I do this, I can just return next response .json session. Export async function. There you go. Now if I go to /API/user, I see my user details. What happens if I log out? If I click on log out, everything goes away. User is logged out, no user details are present anywhere. If I log in from a different user later on, I will see that user's details. So this is how you can get a user's details in a server component, in a client component, and in an API route. The question from here is, how can you get the ID? Right now, if I look at the sign in button, if I sign in, you will see, I see my details. I don't see my ID anywhere. If you remember, when I went to this specific endpoint, whenever we were returning the user's details along with the name and the email, I was returning their ID as well, user ID 1. I don't see that anywhere. Neither is it in the client component, nor is it in the server component. Neither it is in the /API/user endpoint. How do I introduce the ID here? Why is the ID not there in the first place? And the answer is NextAuth by default does not send, everything that you pass here. It will not send the ID. If you do want to send the ID, you have to use something called callbacks, which we'll see very soon. But let's quickly summarize. What have we done? we created the simple next auth provider handler, which handled all the requests that come to where is that slash API slash auth slash anything. Simple credentials provider, added a few .env variables, created an app bar that takes the user to the sign in page and signs them out, created a providers.tsx that currently just wraps the application inside a session provider. In the future, if we need recoil route, this is where we will add it. Wraps the layout with providers. The thing that we've defined here, the providers component, we actually wrap the app inside this providers component over here. Get the user's details in page.tsx, which was a client component. Get the user's details on a server by using the get server session function. Get the user's details in an API route by again using the get server session function. Next up is how can you persist more data? For example, the user ID or something else in all of these hooks. How can you get access to the user ID here? The answer is by default, next auth will not give you them. If you do want it, you can use something called callbacks. There are a bunch of references here, but what are callbacks in next auth is something we'll discuss next. All right, let's look at what callbacks are. Next.js allows you to hook into various parts of authentication via our built-in callbacks. What are these callbacks? As you can see, it says sign in, redirect, session, and JWT. Next auth gives you access to these callbacks, which is basically a bunch of functions inside which you can write some of your own logic. For example, if you look at the sign in callback to begin with, use the sign in callback to control if a user is allowed to sign in or not, which basically means if everything in your application is right, you might write whatever logic you want in this credentials provider. But if you want to block certain people, let's say, okay, bhai, everything is fine, the user was present in the database, all good, but you want to, callbacks comes outside, yeah. If you want to prevent a certain user from blocking an application, what you can do is add a sign in callback. Okay, bhaiya, if user.email is, random person@gmail.com, then don't let them sign in, return false, else return true. So if you want to hook into the lifecycle events, okay, after the sign in has happened, before letting the user know they have signed in, if you want to prevent certain users, you can use the sign in callback. And similarly, there are a bunch of other callbacks. The ones that we will need are the JWT callback and the session callback. Let's start with the JWT callback. Let's start with the JWT callback. This callback is called whenever a JSON web token is created. For example, at sign in, whenever a token is being created, you can hook into this callback and look at what is being encoded. Maybe if you want to make some changes there, you can do that as well. So let's try to see what this JWT callback gives you when it gets called. If I open Visual Studio Code, I can add a JWT callback here, which if you looked at the arguments here, it gave you token, which is an important one. And in our case, at least for now, until we use, login with Google and Facebook, token and user are going to be the important ones. Let me console.log token over here and return token from this function. The callback's goal is कि भाई, if you want to change the token, please do it. If you want to add something here, remove something here. If you want to do, token dot user ID equal to something, or token dot type equal to admin, do it here and then return it back, so that this is the final thing that I will encode. That's what the JWT callback lets you do. If I log the token here and try to re-sign in, so let me go to localhost 3000/auth API sign in and sign in here. As you can see, what gets logged? Name Harkirat Singh, email, sub 1. What is this sub Harkirat? And then, expiry time, initiated time, so on and so forth. What is sub is the question. Name and email, I understand, Harkirat, they come from here. is sub the ID? And the answer is yes. This is just common pattern कि whenever you are signing a JWT, you don't put in an ID there, you put in a subject. Okay, this is the subject of this specific token. And that's why it's 1. So it basically means that the token that is being encoded has the ID in the sub field. Can I change it? Can I do token dot user ID equal to token dot sub? You can do that. If you want, I don't like their convention, I'm going to add a user ID field here. You can do that and return this new token. And now whatever JWT is being encoded will have a user ID field as well that you can use and eventually show on the front end. That is what the JWT callback lets you do. The most popular thing you'll use it for is, just logging the token and seeing what exactly is being encoded by the JWT. The second callback here is the session callback. Let's look at that one. The session callback is called whenever a session is checked. By default, only a subset of the token is returned for increased security. By default, it will not return, the ID and a bunch of other things, IAT, EXP, so on and so forth. It will only give you your name and email, very, lean fields that are usually public. It does not return the ID by default. If you want to, you can use the session callback and, update the session so that whatever reaches the front end has something extra. So why do you need the session callback? You need it because if I open Visual Studio Code, session token user, session dot user ID, user dot ID equal to token dot user ID, or you can do token dot sub, doesn't matter. Return session. Some type errors here. If session and session dot user, then do this. Again, a type error. You can get rid of it by doing an any here, or fix it the right way. For now, I'm just adding an any here. And now, if I refresh, do you see with the email and the name and ID field? Yes, Harkirat, I do. Do you see it here? No, Harkirat, I don't. I don't see it over here in the server render. I do see it on the client. We'll see how you can fix this later on. But at least on the client, I am now receiving an ID as well. How? I hooked into the session and said, bro, the session user dot, I updated the session variable. Okay, bhai, along with the other things that you have, let me log the session here. Along with name and email and image undefined because I never gave it a profile image here. Along with the other things that you have, please have this ID as well and send it to the front end. I know next auth feels okay, by default only a subset is sent, but I know as the developer, okay, ID is an okay field to send to the front end, and hence you send it over here. That's what the session callback lets you do. Do you need the JWT callback? No, right? You can totally remove the JWT callback and be like token.sub, and then again the same thing will happen. So you don't really need the JWT callback. You do need the session callback. Given this information and that the front end has access to the ID, the question remains, how will the backend get access to the ID? Let's understand that next. So if you go to the slides, you will notice I've referred an issue here. Basically, if you look at this issue, it pretty much says get server session is not returning the database user/user ID, which is the same thing that's happening for us, right? The server side component does not have the ID. The client side component does. The way to fix that, that's mentioned in this issue, if you look at the most popularly looked at comment here. So I finally figured it out. Easy mistake actually. When you're calling get server session in a server component or in any server environment, make sure you pass the auth options as an argument. This is what we were missing or / we are missing right now. So the one thing you have to do if you need access to the ID on the server is step 1, move this Next.js config to a separate file. Let me copy this next auth config, basically the object that you're passing into a separate file. You can pass it wherever you want. I'm going to pass it in lib/auth.ts. export const next underscore auth equal to this. And use this variable both over here in the next auth slash route.ts and wherever you are using get server side session. So if I paste it here, you see it. If I paste it here, you see it here as well. So now if I look at the browser, you will see it has, even the server component has my name, my email, as well as my ID. So whenever you are using a general rule of thumb, whenever you're using get server session, make sure you're passing in the next auth config. Make sure you extract out the config into a separate file. Even if I go to /API/user, which is the endpoint that we had created, here also you have access to the ID. If you have access to the ID, you can do 10 different things with it. You don't usually need access to these on the server. You can always hit the database for these. You do need access to this on the server, which is why ID is super crucial for you to be able to fetch in an endpoint like this. That's all for this slide. Let me see if I'm missing something here. That's pretty much it. Here is the final code if you don't want to code it yourself. And in the upcoming 2 slides, adding Google Provider and adding GitHub Provider, we will see how easy it is for us to update this config only very slightly and add login with Google and login with what are the 2 providers we're supporting, Google and GitHub very soon. But if you understand these 2, you can add any other provider. All right, now you'll see the actual power of abstraction and how easy next auth makes it for you to add providers like Google. So if you open this page, it'll tell you, okay, bro, first you have to create some credentials in your Google account. So this will only work if you have a GCP account. You will have to create a Google Cloud account. And over there, go to this link, whatever is present on their official page, and create new credentials. I click on create credentials and OAuth client ID over here. It'll ask me a few questions and then give me some credentials. What kind of application is it? It's a web application. What are the authorized JavaScript origins? I have not deployed it anywhere, so it's just going to be localhost :3000. What are the authorized redirect URIs? Here, they give you a hint. Okay, bhai, if you have a production URL, then you should do this. If you're trying it on your localhost machine, then it should be localhost :3000 /API/auth/callback/Google. Again, where will this callback be called or be handled? In the next auth handler. And that's it. Click on create. I mean, if you want to understand how OAuth works under the hood, then it's a whole different story. But adding it is as simple as that. If I copy over this client ID, let me put it in my .env file because that's usually where you should put it. Google ID equal to this thing. I will of course get rid of this before the class ends. Client secret, and you should not share this with everyone. The name itself has secret or Google secret maybe. And given that you have this, if you go back to the docs, you will notice it's as easy as adding this to your providers and you will have login with Google. If I go to auth.ts along with my credentials provider, I add another Google provider over here. I of course need to import it. So let me do that. And then client ID, you see a type error here. Feel free to use this. There's a better way to fix it, but you can just default to an empty string because the type error is okay by string or number is not assignable to string. Why is that? Oh, my bad. If you look at the type error, it says string or undefined is not assignable to string. Basically, TypeScript doesn't know if this actually exists or not in your .env file. Harkiyat, but it does exist. I know, but TypeScript doesn't know that. TypeScript doesn't inspect this .env file, which is why just fall back it to an empty string so that at least the type error goes away. It understands that string was needed, and if this is undefined, it will still fall back to a string. That's it. As long as the keys here are right. Google client ID, Google client ID, Google client secret, Google client secret. If I started already, if I go here, localhost :3000. If I click on the logout button, it logs me out. If I click on the sign in button, along with the username and password, I see sign in with Google. If I click here, Takes me to a Google page. I can select an account. Let's say I select harkir.itr@gmail.com. I see the login with Google accounts details. I see name. I see an ID, which is, my Google ID. I see email. I see image, so on and so forth. So 2 lines of code, and I was able to add login with Google. Just how I could add login with Google, login with GitHub is exactly the same. If I go back to the slides here, the next slide was login with GitHub. If I open this, let me actually revoke the login with Google keys now, else I'll forget. So let me go here and web client 3, let me delete it. Never mind, I'll delete it before the class. And GitHub pretty much remains the same. You can create an app in GitHub, call it, oh shoot, you need, depending on how much security you have, it'll take you a longer time. Give it a name. I'm going to call it, blog, website, a homepage URL, which in our case is what? Localhost 3000. There's a good chance it does not support localhost here. It does. Okay, that's fine. Callback URLs. What was the callback URL in Google? It was, there you go. Do they have one here? No. What was the callback URL in Google? It was this thing right here. So can you guess what it might be for GitHub? It'll be this, hopefully. We'll see. If it doesn't work, we'll come back to it. And expire users, tokens, request users. No. Webhooks is fine. Make this inactive. You don't need a webhook. Allow this GitHub app. Only this account should be fine. Name reserved. Oh, test auth GitHub 2. Let's see. Create a GitHub app. And here it gives you a client ID now. So go to Visual Studio Code, GitHub client ID, and a secret which you can generate over here. Copy GitHub client secret, and you're good to go. Not good to go just yet. What is the one thing that's missing? I forgot to add the GitHub provider. So let me copy the import from here. And let me add the GitHub provider right after the Google provider. Again, type errors. And GitHub ID I'm going to replace in .env. GitHub secret I'm going to replace in .env. Whatever you're using here is what you need to use here. If you want to stick to whatever I had here, you can just copy that over here. Doesn't matter. Save this. Go to localhost 3000. Log out. Log back in. And you have a sign in with GitHub button. If I click on it, it says try signing into a different account. Client ID is required. GitHub ID, GitHub ID, GitHub secret, GitHub secret. Let's try that one more time. Refresh. Sign with GitHub. There you go. Test auth GitHub by Kirath would like permissions to yada yada yada. Authorize. And if I go back, you will see user name Kirath, email, image, so on and so forth. So that's how you can do auth in Nextauth. As you can see, makes your life very easy. And the best part is it's still in-house. You still own these keys. These keys were created in your own, these credentials were created in your own GitHub, in your own Google. So it's very easy for you to move if you want to move to a different library. This is still in-house authentication. Of course, a lot of this is, abstracted from you thanks to the library that we're using. But this is still, a great starting point to do authentication. Not even starting point. This is like a good production worthy authentication library. And you're still doing a lot of this in-house, mostly all of this in-house. So, it's going to be very cheap. You're not paying per user. If you used something like, if you remember from the beginning of the slides, I shared a few, providers that make it very easy to do authentication, but they get very expensive. They charge you per user. Let's say they charge you, $1 per user per year. If you have 100,000 users, you're paying them $100,000. So Yeah, this is why you want to do it in-house. The last thing that's left is a custom not sign up page, like sign in page. Right now, we have this page. You might want to change its UI. So how can you create your own sign up page? If you look at app.herdexdevs.com, we have our own sign in page that looks slightly prettier than the default one. If you joined the cohort early, then you might have remembered that originally our page looked something like this, but now it looks something like this. The question is, how can you create a custom page? Let's understand that next. All right, next up, let's understand how can you create a custom sign-in page. It's very straightforward. First thing you have to do is just, design the page however you want. So I can create a sign-in / page.tsx, which export default function return div sign-in page. If I go to localhost 3000 / sign in, I see sign in page here. Great starting point. I mean, I can add a bunch of input boxes. In fact, I have a very clean page written here already. So let me just copy and paste that. My sign in page looks decent. It has a sign in with Google, sign in with GitHub, sign in with email, which is just, 3 buttons. Question is, what gets called when I click on this button? What gets called when I click on the sign in with GitHub button? And what gets called when you do a login with email? I of course need 2 input boxes here. I've written a very straightforward code, but you ideally want to put, input type equal to text, and then another input box that has, type equal to password, placeholder equal to password, so on and so forth. For the third button over here, and you probably want to design it a little bit better, but you get the idea. You have 3 buttons. The first one does await sign in and passes in Google as the first argument. Sign in comes from next auth / react. So this is what you have to do. As you have add 10 different providers. If you have your own custom page, just call sign in with the provider name, and that will call the right provider, and you can design the UI however you want. And if you want to use credentials, which means, username, password, then just make sure you're calling it with credentials and passing in whatever credentials you want to send to the backend. Either of these would work. So if I, click on login with Google over here. Oh, I just deleted my auth, my bad. GitHub, I probably changed the secret here. I did change the secret here. But as you saw, I did change the secret over here. So it should have failed, and it did fail, but it took me back to the original sign-in page. This is bad. It should take me back to this page only, right? We want to get rid of this page completely. So you need to tell next auth, okay, bhai, this is the new sign-in page where you should send all the people. So, along with all the changes that we've made, and I'll show very soon how these can work. I mean, if you have the right Google key and GitHub key, then it will work. I just deleted them, which is why you don't see anything. But the important thing is, how can you tell next auth, okay, bhai, the sign-in page now looks something like /sign-in, and the answer is you can do this. Okay, bhai, the sign-in page is at /sign-in, and now if I refresh and click on login with GitHub, even if it's RNS, the user comes back to the sign-in page with maybe some error in the URL query param. So you can pass this error and show the user an error if need be. But now next auth knows. Now even if I'm on the landing page and click on the sign-in button here, what was this sign-in button doing? If I was clicking on the sign-in button, it was calling sign in from next auth / react, which means even if I was clicking on this, it will now take me to the /sign-in page. Why? Because I told next auth, okay, by sign-in page is not your custom sign-in page anymore. It's present here. Whenever you want to take the user to the sign-in page, whenever user clicks on sign-in button, you take them to the /sign-in endpoint and not to your original created auth sign-in page. So that's pretty much it. That's how you can create a custom page. We have the same thing. So if you go to code CMS, you will see the code is like very similar. What we've learned and what the codes here is fairly similar. If you go to lib/auth.ts, you will see it has pages sign-in /sign-in at the very end. If you look at the session, we sort of store the role of the user, whether this user is an admin or a user, things like these. So yeah, you can go through this now. It's a little bit bigger because it doesn't do in-house authentication. It also has the logic to hit another place, which is Apex or whatever this specific website's backend is, to check the user's authentication, which is why the authorize function is so long. But if you look at it, it's fairly straightforward how to do credentials. Every code base that you open that uses NextAuth will look very similar. Cool. With that, I think that's the end of this one. Again, all of this code is present here. If you want to just read the code, feel free to. We can call it here. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.